Today we're going to talk about how RudderStack works and why we're going to use RudderStack. So we're going to start with an example of what we actually use internally here at RudderStack. So for our own internal setup, we have our marketing website and our web app. Our web app being the RudderStack product that is actually used by our customers and how we track the customer data within that. For our case, we have a number of destinations we use, but for today we're going to focus on these 5. The main use of RudderStack is to centralize our implementation of all of the different destinations where we want to capture this customer data. So for this specific example, we're going to use the event which is a user signing up for our web app. So sales wants that data in Salesforce so they can track that as a lead. Marketing wants it in Google Analytics so they can track conversions around ad spending and other campaigns. Product wants it in Amplitude so that they can start their user journeys and user flows. And then we put everything for data purposes into our Snowflake, into Data Warehouse. We're also going to discuss how we use Customer I/O for marketing, but that's actually not going to be one of the primary use cases. We'll come back to that at the end. So for all of these destinations, typically in a website or a web app that we want to send data to, these are instrumented specifically and individually on the website or in the web app. So that means we have to include some type of SDK or network call to Salesforce, Google Analytics, Amplitude, and Snowflake. Those can all look different, they can all load their own specific libraries, and they're all going to entail a separate HTTP network request to those destinations. So instead of instrumenting all these separately, today we're going to talk through instrumenting all of these as an identify call when a user signs up. So we're going to track a user sign up event, which is going to be one singular event that we can instrument on the RudderStack SDK. And at the end, we want to have all of that in all of these destinations. So we want it in Salesforce, we want it in GA, we want it in Amplitude, and we want it in Snowflake, which is our data warehouse. And then eventually, we like it in Customer I/O as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate all of these integrations in our app. We're going to take all the code out for those. We're going to implement just the single RudderStack SDK, and we're going to send one single event, so one SDK, one network call to process all these events to the downstream tools. The other powerful thing that this gives us is that by instrumenting just a single event, we're able to put the power back in our team's hands of how they want to handle these integrations. So if marketing wants to add a tool or replace a tool, or product wants to change a tool, they can do that from within their RudderStack dashboard, and we don't have to deploy new SDKs and add bulk, slow down our site, and cause performance issues by adding those additional integrations. Or if we want to change and completely use a different tool, we don't have to go in and redeploy code to do that. So when we call this singular event, once we've integrated the RudderStack SDK in our website or web app, we call this event. The SDK is going to give us some free information as well. So it's going to collect some data around the context of that user. It's going to collect the user agent, the locale, different traits about that user's device, where they're from. And then it's also, the SDK is also going to give us some niceties in that any traits that we add to a user through an identify call are going to be automatically persisted into the subsequent track and page calls. So we'll have all of that information for free in downstream tools for those subsequent calls. And that'll be treated differently by all these downstream destinations depending on their use cases and what the information that they need from the customer data that we're sending to them. So we also have, besides the client-side JavaScript SDK, we have server-side SDKs that can be used and an HTTP endpoint in a case where we don't want to use a client-side SDK. So those may be for high-value conversion events that are from the back end, things that are computed on whether it's sign-ups or user actions on the server side of things, or just bulk importing data from certain user actions that exist primarily in a server setting, or even to avoid events that are being blocked by ad trackers or by ad blockers. We also have mobile SDKs for mobile apps. So if you are using an iOS native app, an Android native app, a React native, Flutter, Unity, those apps have SDKs that can be used as well to ingest data from those other sources, again, into these same downstream tools without having to set those up separately or instrument them specifically within your app. So just to recap on what we've done here with the SDK, we're going to eliminate all 5 of these integrations, which is going to allow us to eliminate some library code, some additional JavaScript code and bloat on our website. It's going to speed our site up, increase performance and SEO, and just simplify the whole implementation for our engineering team. So now that we've got our SDK implemented, we need to set up our pipelines. So RudderStack is architected by design to be two separate parts. So we have our control plane, and this is where we're going to set up our, all of our pipelines. So our control plane is going to be completely separated from our data plane, which is where our data is processed. This is going to give us control over how our data is handled, where it's handled, and who has access to it. So the control plane is going to be our dashboard. So this is where we're going to set up all of the pipelines. So we have these various sources and the various downstream tools, and we're going to tell the app where to send these. The control plane is also going to be where we're going to store authentication secrets and settings specific to these destinations. So this, as I mentioned earlier, this is going to allow all of these teams to control their integrations and not rely on engineering to deploy new code when they need to make changes or change authentication keys. That can all be done from within the control plane. These secrets can be managed. Like I said, the settings can be managed, and different pipelines and tools can be modified, added, and removed without involving engineering at all. So the event streaming is going to be set up here. We're also going to have where we control our syncs. Our syncs are going to be how we manage events coming in from Cloud Extract and warehouse action sources. But we'll discuss that a little bit later. But those will be managed in your control plane as well. And then you'll also have an audit log in here, which will show which team members are adding or modifying or changing which destinations and sources, so that we can have control over who's modifying within our control plane. So now we're going to discuss the data plane. This is where our data is actually sent, processed, and delivered to the downstream destination. So this is where the bulk of the work of RudderStack is happening, in the server itself. The RudderServer is a Kubernetes deployed app that consists of a number of different pods. We won't get into Kubernetes right now, but Kubernetes is essentially a system that's used to deploy, scale, and manage distributed apps of smaller services. So within the data plane, we're going to have a number of services. The primary service that's going to handle the ingestion of events is going to be called the gateway. So the gateway is essentially going to be receiving the events as they come in from the SDKs, the HTTP sources, or any of our other Cloud Extract or warehouse sources. So this event that we're sending on the front end of user signed up is going to come into the gateway. So the gateway is handled as a separate pod very specifically, so that if there are any other issues with anything else within the server, we have the gateway always available. So the server can go into what's called degraded mode, and what that means is that the gateway is up and something else in the server may be crashing, so the events are not being processed to downstream tools, but we're still ingesting them at the gateway, and so once everything comes back up, we can continue to process events without losing anything. So when events get to the gateway, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to be stored in a Postgres database. And so you may be thinking, I thought RudderStack didn't store my event data. We don't store it long term, but we do persist it long enough to process it and send it to the downstream tools, and then eventually these tables are dropped completely, so we have no record of the data. So when the events come in to RudderStack, they're going to come into the gateway, and then the gateway is going to store them in a Postgres table, and once that's happened, it will return to the client a 200 response, which says that the event was received successfully and is now being processed. So this process is designed to be very quick and very reliable from a client point of view. Once in the RudderServer, we have a number of different services that are a part of the data plane that will have various roles within it. Most notably, we have our transformer, which is going to be responsible for getting our data in the right format for downstream tools. And then we have the router, which is what's going to be responsible for routing all of those transformed events to the downstream destinations. We also have a warehouse service, which is going to treat warehouse and batch destinations a little bit differently, and we'll discuss that in a second. And then there are some other pods that we're not really going to pay attention to right now for monitoring, event metrics, reporting, things like that. But these are going to be the main pods that we're going to discuss of how we process data in the RudderServer. So once we've ingested these events into the gateway Postgres table, we're going to have to process them. So to process them, we need to get them in the format of what the downstream tool needs. So they're going to go through the transformer, which is going to change them to the proper format, and then it's going to store them, again, temporarily in another Postgres table, but it's going to store the events that need to go into the downstream tools. So where we have one event coming in right here, we're going to have, in this case, 4 events going into the router Postgres table. And so these are going to be events that have now been transformed into the format that Salesforce or Google Analytics or Amplitude or Snowflake need to accept those events. So we'll come back to the transformer and discuss a couple of things with it in a second, but for now we're going to continue to follow the process of these events through RudderStack. So once these events have been processed through the transformer and are in the router tables, the tables at the gateway are going to be dropped completely. So as I mentioned before, we won't have any record of those events moving forward. So we now have 4 different events that are being stored temporarily in the router table. That's not completely true because, as I mentioned earlier, Snowflake, being a data warehouse, is going to be treated a little bit differently. So it's actually going to be handled in a different table. But for the purposes of this, we're going to show them here. So at this point, the router is going to take these events and going to send them out into the downstream tools. So it's going to send an event to Salesforce. It's going to send a separate event to Google Analytics, a separate event to Amplitude, and then the warehouse service is going to upload our events to Snowflake on a predefined schedule. The warehouse is treated separately because of compute costs with warehouse destinations. So instead of streaming the data live to the warehouse, what we're actually going to do is the warehouse service is going to create staging files on a temporary storage platform, typically something like S3. And once those have been stored, the warehouse service itself will, on a predefined schedule by the user, will take these staging files and upload them into Snowflake in a batch process, which will save on compute costs because, again, generally we're sending everything to our data warehouse, so it's going to be a large amount of volume, and we don't want to just stream that over live. So at the end of this process, we've essentially sent this one user sign-up event in. It's been processed as needed and then sent to the appropriate accounts in its proper format. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and discuss transformers now. So the transformer is going to take the raw event that's coming from the gateway and process it into what's needed for the downstream tool. There are 2 types of transformers, though. There's user transformers, which are custom transformers built by our customers to modify their data as needed. And then there's the default transformer, which is what RudderStack manages to get that data into its proper downstream format. So user transformations are nothing more than JavaScript functions that process JSON objects. So every event coming into RudderStack is a JSON object, and the custom transformers can be used to do anything you can do in JavaScript to those events, as long as we're returning a proper JSON object of an event back. So that's going to allow us to do a number of things. We can use a third-party API if we want to from within the transformer to enrich that event data. We can whitelist certain traits so that, for example, for Salesforce, if we're collecting custom fields on this event that don't exist in Salesforce, the event to Salesforce will fail because that custom field doesn't exist on Salesforce. We can also filter specific events. So again, for Salesforce, we get charged per API call, and so we only want to send these high-value events where we want to create leads in Salesforce to the downstream tool. So we'll filter specific events to go to Salesforce that might not go to Amplitude or Google Analytics or to Snowflake. We can also mask and remove specific traits from these events in the transformer. So if we want to mask something like PII for Google Analytics, or again, whitelisting traits for Salesforce, we can do that from within a transformation. So the transformations are going to always take place as the user transformation first, and then it'll go through the destination transformation. So once it's gone through the destination transformation, this is kind of where some of the magic of RudderStack comes in as well. These transformers are actually managing the data so that it's in the right format for the downstream tool. So what happens if any of these downstream tools change their APIs? Normally, if you were instrumenting these events on your own, you would be responsible for re-implementing that, redeploying code, testing it, and making sure that your event data is in the proper format for these downstream tools. So since RudderStack is handling this transformer code, we're able to update these APIs for you, which provides the peace of mind that we're handling this, so any downstream changes are being handled within RudderStack and will be fixed before they become an issue on your end. We also handle retry logic. So if for some reason Salesforce is down or someone has changed our authentication keys for Amplitude, normally those events would just die in the client, would never make it to the downstream destination. Because of the way the router handles these events, if the router encounters an error that it can recover from, it's going to continue to keep those events in the table and back off with some specific retry logic to continue to retry those events until they can succeed to their downstream destinations, or until they, if they've determined that they can't make it to the downstream destination. So again, one of the primary benefits of this back half of the RudderStack is that you're not having to manage the downstream APIs or changes to them. You're not having to deal with retry logic, and so any changes made to any of these destinations are handled automatically for you by RudderStack. So now that all of this event data has been processed into the downstream tools, the router tables are dropped and the gateway tables are dropped, so RudderStack has no knowledge of any of these events. That's going to provide an increased level of compliance and control and even cost for our users, because we're not having to pay to store any of that on disk, and we're not having to worry about what happens to the data that's here if anything needs to be cleaned down the road. So, until this point, we've only discussed the event stream data that's coming from our SDKs, our servers, our apps into the RudderStack platform and into downstream tools. Often we find that doesn't tell the whole story of the user journey, and so that's where our other two products come into play. So Cloud Extract is going to allow us to include event data from cloud sources into RudderStack and then downstream into our data warehouse. So this could be conversation data from something like Intercom or Zendesk, transaction data from Stripe, or marketing data from something like Marketo or another upstream tool. So this is going to allow us to import that data through RudderStack and use our existing connections to send it into our warehouse and enrich that data that we have here. These events that come in from Cloud Extract also run through a custom transformer as well. So if any modification needs to be made on the user side, we can control some of that data before it's being processed into our warehouse. So Cloud Extract is going to be used as RudderStack's basically ETL solution to get that structured data out of our cloud sources and combined with all of our event data into their warehouse. So now that we have this enriched data in our warehouse, we have to figure out how to get this gold back through to other downstream tools. So that's where Warehouse Actions come in. So Warehouse Actions is RudderStack's essentially reverse ETL tool, which is going to send data from your warehouse back through RudderStack and then back to your downstream destinations. So this could look like a number of things. A lot of times this will be basically a master users table that's created from all of our event stream data that's been enriched with Cloud Extract sources, and we can create a golden record of our users and then pipe that data back through into our downstream tools to make sure that everything's in sync. Further, as we discussed earlier, in Customer I/O we want to have more of an enriched customer view of how we're going to segment these customers. So this is going to actually be built off the data that we have in Snowflake. We're going to derive that table of what we want to be in Customer I/O, and that's going to be sent back through RudderStack through Warehouse Actions, and again, go through transformations, which we can modify that as needed, and then that data will actually be sent back into Customer I/O after it's been enriched with our Cloud Extract data and anything else that we want to compute on top of our warehouse. So these Warehouse Actions are going to allow us to create an enriched and 360 view of our customers and pipe that data back through RudderStack into our downstream tools to have all of those records synced across our tools. So that can be anything from managing and controlling sessions, enriching customer views, handling first touch attribution, calculating lead scoring. Really anything that you would do on top of your data warehouse can now be piped back through RudderStack through Warehouse Actions and then synced into these downstream tools. So at the end of this, we've essentially been able to eliminate all of these integrations on our front end. We were able to integrate a single event and pipe it through RudderStack, get it reliably to our downstream destinations, and then begin to create those enriched customer views on top of our warehouse and pipe those all back through RudderStack.